Let's go via Skype to Washington, D.C. and continue the conversation now, bringing in our good friend Armstrong Williams, the host of the eponymously named Armstrong Williams Show. Armstrong, thanks so much for spending some time with us again on America's Forum.
Good morning, Congressman.
Very much appreciate your time. When you hear the Attorney General and the President talk about ending racial profiling, putting forth stringent new guidelines, what do you expect those guidelines might include?
Listen, there is an aspect of this country that feel maligned, disrespected, devalued, and whether that's real or not, as American and Congressman, you're being a member that austere body at one time understands that we are our brother's keeper. Whether we disagree with the president's approach and the Attorney General, it is something that needs to be addressed, whether that is placing cameras, whether it's how we train police officers, because the thing that we don't talk about and what gets lost in this, Congressman, is that 90% of law enforcement don't shoot people down because they have the power, they have the badge, and it's their judgment. Most of them, through experience and through common sense and judgment, are able to navigate and not use deadly force to apprehend and bring control to a situation that can get out of hand. Obviously, Officer Wilson was afraid. He was 28 years old, and he's fearful for his life. And he reacted. He followed his training. And yes, someone died in the process, and that's unfortunate. Something has to be done. What that something is, the president's ideas, their ideas, because you're not going to ever end racial profiling, especially in the majority of these cities, in inner cities, where the majority of killing is done by young men who happen to be black. I mean, how else are you going to make a determination, and how else are you going to come to some conclusion that somebody else is committing these crimes when the majority look a certain way? We have got to get to the point where in those communities, they must feel their self-worth. They must feel their value. They must feel that there's opportunity for them in America instead of laying in some wasteland and these things that we call projects, where when many people grew up, decades ago, they had firefighters, teachers, lawyers, doctors coming from that community where they had real role models and they had fathers. Something has gone terribly wrong in America, and it's going to take all of us to try to find some resolution to this problem.
Armstrong, two takeaways from your opening comments. Number one, perception becomes reality. And number two, the fact that law enforcement, police, are doing their jobs and not on a power trip in the vast majority of cases, and yet there seems to be a demonization of the police. For example, one of my old friends from Phoenix, Charles Barkley, addressed the situation in Ferguson during an interview on 97.5, the Fanatic Sports Radio. Let's listen to what Chuck said and then get your reaction.
We have to be really careful with the cops, man, because if it wasn't for the cops, we'd be living in the wild, wild west in our neighborhoods. I think we can't pick out certain incidents that don't go our way and act like the cops are all bad. I hate when we do that, because think about it. Do you know how bad some of these neighborhoods would be if it wasn't for the cops?
Armstrong, 20 seconds, your response to Charles Barkley's thought.
He's absolutely correct, and this is not really about law enforcement. It's what happens when white police officers shoot somebody who happens to be black. Blacks can shoot blacks, black cops can shoot black kids. But it's more of the demonization of white men, because they have used them as the poster child now, everything that is wrong with America. You can discriminate against them, and now you can hold a different standard for them when they wear the badge. That's what it's about. It's much deeper than what we want to talk about.
Fair enough, and because the topic is so deep, we're going to ask you to stay with us, Armstrong. Back on the other side, more with Armstrong Williams here on America's Forum. Let's continue the conversation with Armstrong Williams, the host of the Armstrong Williams Show, again Skyping in from the nation's capital. We touched on the whole notion of body cameras earlier. Do you think that is a positive sign? That's something needed?
Oh, absolutely it works. There's no question. The results are in. 83 to 90% of the time when their cameras are on, the police are at their best behavior, and oftentimes the so-called victim is at their best behavior. And even for the body camera, people think that it's only for the people that are making the accusations against law enforcement, but it also protects law enforcement, because sometimes what the media will report is a certain frame of what took place, and it looks as though that the law enforcement is at fault. But if you further look at the frames of the camera, you could see that this person just hit the police officer in the face, and that was not shown in the beginning. And as you look at the fullness of it, you begin to realize that the officer was absolutely correct in the actions that he took in that situation. So it protects both.
It is important to the context and events actually as they happen. Another type of cameras, in another context, during the protest that turned riots, sadly in some cases, Thanksgiving week in Ferguson, with the cameras there and the media attention, how many of the protesters do you believe came in from outside, for lack of a better term, Armstrong, outside agitators?
You know, listen, I actually believe this reminds me of the Wall Street protests, where they used to go from city to city, New York and Washington, D.C. I actually think that these protesters are organized. I actually think they're encouraged to protest and riot because they have a greater agenda that we're not able to see yet. And I think as more and more of this is unveiled and the media backs down and decides to report the fullness of the story, much of this we'll find out. But, you know, but to me, that point is muted, Congressman, by the fact, and this is what's so troublesome to many Americans like myself, is the fact that you don't need cameras in instances like that. You have the National Guard, you have law enforcement actually watching these people loot, steal, destroy, burn down, and they did absolutely nothing. How in the world, and you know something happened higher up, somebody had to tell them, just like what is happening with our military today, they tie their arms behind their backs so they cannot do their jobs. You cannot allow these criminals to further criminalize and destroy businesses and destroy property as they did. So I shirt and shiver in my shoes when I think about the image of law enforcement and the National Guard just standing back and a lot of these looters to just get away scot-free. What does that tell us? Where are we going as a nation?
And again, you raised a point that in a minute left, who's behind it? We know there's a partisan divide between the governor, a Democrat, Jay Nixon, in Missouri, and his Republican lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor was saying, now, wait a minute, there's the Guard called out, but the first night they were not there on time, and he suggested there might be some sort of complicity or request from the president and the attorney general. Who do you think was behind the absence of force despite the presence of the Guard?
You don't have to ask. That could have only come from the White House and the Justice Department. No other place could you override a governor, state law enforcement, where they sit back and are useless. It had to come from the White House. That is not even something someone has to think about. It's just common sense.
Fair enough. And on that note of common sense, a man noted for his common sense, why we have him so often, Armstrong Williams, we thank you for your time and your input today.
Thank you, Congressman.
Good to hear from Armstrong. And there is more straight ahead on America's Forum.